Hello, my name is Andrew Davis of Durham University. This talk is about assessment and the phonics check. I'll talk quite a bit about the check itself as an assessment device. I will also use it as a starting point to investigate wider issues relating to educational assessment. A good deal of what I offer here is by way of introducing you to debates. I will give you some information, especially in this introduction. I hope you will be provoked into thinking through the issues for yourselves. However, you do need to know where I'm coming from. I don't try particularly hard to hide my views as I go along. You may well disagree with some or even all of them. This open letter to Michael Gove, written 6 years ago, gives you a clue. I'm assuming that I'm talking to people with varying knowledge of the teaching of reading and of synthetic phonics in particular. So I will go over some basics. My apologies to all of you who really don't need this. Varieties of phonics include analytic and synthetic. For the benefit of the uninitiated here, analytical phonics. Pupils are taught to focus on letter sequences that might represent words. They are encouraged to identify word families such as boat, coat and goat, or gate, hate and mate. Now for synthetic phonics. You learn the sounds linked to letters and groups of letters. You see a piece of text, look at the letters and associate these with sounds. You then blend these sounds to form a composite sound. This result might represent a word as it could be heard in speech. A very basic example would be blending the sounds associated with the letters M, A and N. M, A, N. The blend is man, or F, O, G. The blend is fog. Now, for a little about the history of how the UK has taught children to read. Phonics was or were influential up to the late 50s. Indeed, phonics is or are referenced in this book, 1667. And here's a phonics reader from 1929. By the 1960s, look and say, associated with whole language approaches to reading, was popular in primary schools in the UK. It concentrated on recognising words as wholes. A few of you may remember Janet and John. Recently, phonics has re-emerged in various guises. Certain other countries are moving strongly towards phonics too, including Australia. You may have heard of the so-called reading wars. These have raged for decades in many parts of the world. They broadly consist of disputes between phonics supporters and others. They continue even while given teaching approaches come in and out of favour. Wars need sides to oppose. In the First World War, the Allies encouraged widespread stereotypes of Germans. British citizens were told that the Hun cut off the hands of children and used priests as clappers in bells. This was to stimulate hatred of the other and to encourage the growth of patriotic feeling. For the other to be imagined, the main tool is stereotyping. Stereotypes, by definition, overlook the fine-grainedness of reality. They collect together into a falsely homogeneous class an otherwise inconvenient variety of individuals and their detailed characteristics. Some aspects of the reading wars echo these phenomena. People have constructed laughably inadequate stereotypes of how reading is taught, such as whole language, look and say, and of phonics varieties such as systematic, analytic, or synthetic. These stereotypes, or straw men, are used as weapons to demonize opponents. Yet those falling under any of these labels would rarely be doing exactly the same as each other. Another project drawn into the reading wars was the National Literacy Strategy. It began in England in 1997 and it applied to all state schools. It ran for many years. Its searchlight model for the teaching of reading involved at least 4 strategies: phonics of various kinds, grammar clues, context, including pictures, word shapes, including analogies with known words. For a time, the National Literacy Strategy had a high profile. While not statutory, it was thought by many schools to be one of the lenses through which they would be examined by Ofsted. Ruth Kelly, one of the Secretaries of State for Education during New Labour's terms of office, was an explicit supporter of synthetic phonics. She mentioned it in her 2005 letter to Rose, setting up his government-initiated report on the teaching of reading. That same government funded a systematic review of the same topic. The published version of that review is known as the Torgerson Report 2006. It came to modest conclusions. It mildly favoured phonics in general, but not synthetic phonics in particular. By the way, Torgerson updated this systematic review a year or so ago, and it reached very similar conclusions. The government-initiated Rose Report that immediately followed the original Torgerson ignored its very cautious conclusions. It gave strong support to synthetic phonics. Carol Torgerson asked Jim Rose why he had done this. She has never had any kind of answer. Meanwhile, the National Literacy Strategy was withdrawn. The multi-curing strategies, searchlights for young readers that the strategy supported, are opposed by phonics supporters. I will now go into some detail about current government policy in relation to synthetic phonics. It's important because it gives us strong clues as to the motivations that might be behind the phonics check. You will know that how assessment is used is crucial when we consider its educational advantages and disadvantages. At a deeper level, we must confront the thorny questions about what it actually measures, or whether we can in principle ever determine such a thing. The Year 1 statutory programmes of study. Pupils should be taught to apply phonics knowledge and skills as the route to decode words. Respond speedily with the correct sound to graphemes, letters or groups of letters, for all 40 plus phonemes, including where applicable alternative sounds for graphemes. Read accurately by blending sounds in unfamiliar words containing grapheme phoneme correspondences that have been taught. These programs of study, their content are influenced strongly by the Rose report that I've already mentioned. Rose opposed the National Literacy's searchlights. He said, quote, "Switching between various searchlight strategies, particularly when phonic work is regarded as only one such strategy, all of equal worth, risks paying insufficient attention to the critical skills of word recognition, which must first be secured by beginner readers." End of quote. Rose also said, quote, "This means teaching relatively short, discrete, daily sessions designed to progress from simple elements to the more complex aspects of phonics knowledge, skills, and understanding." End of quote. The statutory requirements oppose mixed methods or multi-cueing. Interestingly, the training materials for Ofsted inspectors themselves, issued in 2014, was one place where the wording in relation to the potential prescription of teaching approaches was much more circumspect. They said then, quote, "The research evidence for what sort of phonics teaching is simply insufficient to provide a basis for choosing between analytic or synthetic phonics. It is better, therefore, to have systematic phonics teaching than unsystematic or no phonics teaching, and to give children the knowledge, skills, and understanding they need to move forward confidently as readers and writers." End of quote. Now for a brief description of the phonics check itself. The phonics screening check contains 40 words, divided into two sections of 20 words. Both sections contain a mixture of real words and pseudo words. The pseudo words such as ect, osk, and han are labelled as pseudo words or non-words by being flanked by little pictures of aliens or monsters. Now, let's have a look at two pseudo words from the 2019 phonics check. How must MEAST be pronounced? Apparently, the guidelines say it combines the from March with the E, that's EA, from leaf or deaf, and the ST from feast. How must ZOME be pronounced? Apparently, they tell us, it uses the Z from zero and rhymes with home, so zome. The guidelines say when decoding a pseudo word, all plausible alternative pronunciations are acceptable. The scoring guidance gives some alternative pronunciations, but the list of acceptable pronunciations is not exhaustive. They say a pupil's accent should be taken into account when deciding whether a response is acceptable. Any pronunciation difficulties should be taken into account as well. For example, a pupil unable to form the th sound, who instead usually says fwa, should have this scored as correct. Now some basics about the check. All Year 1 pupils must take the check, unless they have no understanding of grapheme-phoneme correspondences. Year 2 pupils in the following categories should also take the check. Pupils who did not take the check in Year 1 because they were absent, were working below the standard of the check, or had recently arrived in the country and couldn't speak confidently in English. Any pupil who took the check in Year 1 but did not meet the expected standard. Any pupil who entered the schooling system in Year 2. If you cannot establish whether the pupil took the check in Year 1, the pupil should take the check in Year 2. The check is marketed as being outside our high-stakes assessment system. Such a stance is wildly implausible. Ofsted takes account of the results. Parents are informed of their children's performances. Pupils failing to reach the required standard retake the test in Year 2. The school's minister, Nick Gibb, actually writes special letters to primary schools who have done well in the check. Some schools are pleased to receive these communications from Nick Gibb. They even advertise them on social media as a kind of badge of honour. How is the check marketed by our education policy makers? They say it allegedly enables teachers to discover which pupils are still experiencing problems in decoding. This is on the grounds that such problems must be caught as soon as possible and dealt with. Now for some immediate possible reservations about the check as an assessment device. The check words are out of context. Compare this situation with what is likely to happen about decoding in everyday classroom practice. Teachers regularly monitor decoding skills as and when necessary, while the pupil is tackling text in context. That could include other words that the teacher knows the pupil already recognises. These are real reading situations as opposed to the highly artificial and limited examples afforded by the check. The phonics check claims to measure whether children can associate certain sounds with letters and blend them together to produce a plausible result. As a matter of fact, it only assesses decoding by means of the 20 pseudo words it contains, and arguably a severely restricted subset of decoding activities. I'll say more about this later. Let's think for a moment about teaching to the test. It is, of course, a classic issue in educational assessment. The expression is often used as a negative comment on certain kinds of teaching. The phonics check has certainly led to a variety of teaching to the test activities. Anecdotally, from many schools, practicing and decoding nonsense words. Here's a different example of teaching to the test, allegedly sorting real words from nonsense words. What does teaching to the test mean in terms of those nonsense words? While we're there, let's think a little more in general terms about teaching to the test. Are we always clear what teaching to the test is precisely supposed to be and why it is bad when it is bad? We do need to ask perhaps whether teaching to the test is always harmful. What distinguishes harmful from virtuous teaching to the test? Those associated board music exams, the scales and arpeggios. Teach pupils to play 3 octaves of the A major scale. This is what will be tested in the exam. Teaching to the test. Sounds fine. The driving test. The 3-point turn is tested, so the driving instructor gets you to practice it, to learn it. Teaching to the test. Fine. Here are a few features of bad teaching to the test. When it reduces rich understanding to a mere series of performances required by examiners. Depending on the test, teaching to the test may distort relational understanding in the direction of instrumental understanding. Let's explore this distinction between instrumental and relational understanding. It's due to the psychologist Richard Skemp, and it goes back many years. He explained the distinction by appealing to an analogy. Picture 2 people, Smith and Jones, trying to find their way to a wedding in a town with which they are not familiar. Smith has been supplied by his host with a series of directions. Turn right, under the railway bridge, past Sainsbury's, turn left by the War Memorial, and so on, until he reaches the church. If Smith follows the directions, he will arrive at the wedding on time. If he fails to follow that sequence of directions, he has no way of constructing a new route to the church. He is likely to be late. Jones has the same series of directions. He has a map of the town and can read it. If Jones loses his way, he can look at the map and work out a new route to the church. He has a much greater chance of being in church for the start of the wedding than has Smith. A student whose understanding is modelled on Smith's position in the strange town is restricted to the instrumental variety. At best, she has knowledge and skills that are not interrelated. They are not, so to speak, on her cognitive map. They are isolated from each other. She will only be able to do one thing with them, produce them on demand in a test or similar, in a context very like that in which she acquired them in the first place. Many have noted that their maths education gave them little more than this. They had rules without understanding. The traditional long division algorithm was an infamous example of this. Contrast all that with the position of the fortunate student whose understanding echoes Jones's happy position in his attempts to reach the wedding. She possesses her knowledge as positioned on her cognitive maps. She knows, so to speak, where any one of her knowledge items is in relation to other things that she knows. She grasps connections, roots, between the things she knows. Her cognitive map enables her to travel in many different ways between one knowledge item and another. It arguably enables her to transfer her learning from contexts in which she originally acquired it to an indefinite variety of others. Having a cognitive map and learning suitably located and connected on it is a necessary condition for applying the learning in a variety of contexts. Needless to say, the detail on the map and the nature and number of the routes between the various locations is a matter of degree. And again, needless to say, the way we have described all this is deeply metaphorical. Another, a different kind of point about teachings of the test's problems, a familiar one: it takes up space needed for other things, even where it doesn't distort the knowledge concerned. A familiar example, teaching core subjects so much that you are marginalising the arts and so forth. Let's return to our phonics check. How might this check be improved? You might like to think about this. Here are a few thoughts. Suppose that real words were not presented in isolation. Imagine that instead they were included in sentences. How would that affect what is assessed, what is measured? Pupils would either read the sentences or have them read by the teacher. Obviously, there might be a problem about at least some of the pupils being able to read the sentences. So perhaps the teacher must read the sentence, somehow indicating the test word when arriving at it without actually reading it out. And other points, great care would have to be taken with the rest of the sentence. It would need to cover subject matter familiar to the pupils. The check, as I've noted or urged, is high stakes. But must it be so? Suppose the check sampled 5-year-olds rather than being taken by all of them. This might happen, and or parts of the check materials could be supplied to teachers as a resource that they could use selectively. And this would mean that the check would no longer be high stakes. So it could not be employed to hold teachers and schools to account. Would this change what the check measures? If so, would that be a good thing or not? And why? Any attempts to improve the check raises an important issue of distinguishing between accommodation and modification. Accommodation is said to be changing a test without changing what's assessed, e.g. allegedly extra time on the English test for dyslexics. Modification, a test alteration that changes what's assessed. For example, the Key Stage 2 Maths SAT, traditional long multiplication, long division algorithms only required recently. Other multiplication and division methods were allowed before this. Consider some of the adaptations officially allowed for in the phonics check. These are assumed by the test creators, presumably, to be accommodations rather than modifications. For instance, the check materials are provided in font Sassoon Infant, style regular and size 60, but a PDF version of the standard materials is provided to teachers, so this allows the check to be printed onto different coloured paper. And Word versions of the standard materials with coloured pictures are provided, or black and white pictures and no pictures, to enable changing the font size, having fewer words per page, and teachers apparently can remove the imaginary creatures for any pupils who might find them distracting. They say, you may use a coloured overlay if this is normal classroom practice. You can rephrase instructions. The check has a standard introduction. However, if, they say, a pupil is likely to be confused by this wording, you, the teacher, may develop your own. The instructions may refer to the practice words, but must not refer to words within the actual check. Now, how do we know that these are accommodations rather than modifications? After all, we do know from empirical research that tiny variations in how tests are presented can make for significant differences in scores. Removing the imaginary creatures for any pupils who find them distracting, this seems a huge change. Do you signal the non-words in some other way? Consider a test or exam with which you are familiar. Ponder possible changes and whether they would be accommodating or modifying. The changes might not be detailed content changes, but rather the manner of delivery. Handwriting versus the use of the keyboard. More time, the test being read by the tester, and aspects of the tester's manner. Here are two short video clips of the APU maths assessments for 11-year-olds. What's the APU? The Assessment of Performance Unit, a government-funded agency that carried out lots of assessments in the late 70s and early 80s. And these particular video clips are examples of APU practical maths assessments. In this first clip, note the interviewer or the assessor's manner with the child. Note what she isn't doing that you might have done as a teacher.
Use the balance to find out which of these blocks is heavier.
B.
And how do you know that B is heavier?
Because when you balance them, that one goes down, so it's heavier.
Use the balance to find out which of these blocks is the heaviest.
C.
And how did you work that out?
I balanced two of them. Which one was the heaviest, I balanced again the next one.
Fine. Would you like to pass the other one to me? What do you call this?
Wait.
Okay. It's a 20-gram weight. I'd like you to make a lump of plasticine that's as heavy as the 20-gram weight. As you're going along, can you tell me what you're doing?
Yes. I put the weight in the scales. I'm trying to make this plasticine the same weight. That's the same way.
May I have the weight, please? Now I'd like you to make a lump of plasticine that's half as heavy as this 20 gram weight. I'd like to hold the weight, if you don't mind. What did you decide to do?
Made half of the plasticine, so it's half the weight. That's half the weight.
That's half, is it? And what does each half of the plasticine weigh?
10 grams.
Thank you.
Now for the second clip.
I'd like you to make a lump of plasticine that's half as heavy as this 20 gram weight.
Should I use this?
Whatever you think's right. What are you trying to decide?
I don't get it much.
Mm-hmm.
Can't do it.
What you're trying to find is a lump of plasticine that's half as heavy as this 20 gram weight. How much does the whole lump of plasticine weigh?
20.
Mm-hmm. And can you think of a way of finding out half of it? Okay. You started using the balance on one side. What were you going to try and do?
Make both of them the same size. Trying to make both the same size.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I do it?
Would you like to try that? Yes.
Although Rachel seemed a bit anxious and said initially that she didn't know how to do the task, the tester felt she did have some idea and wanted to give her the time and opportunity to succeed.
That was a pretty good guess, wasn't it? Now, what does each half of the plasticine weigh?
10
10 what?
grams.
10 grams, okay. Let's take the plasticine out.
Compare and contrast the styles of the assessors. The second interviewer helps the girl rather than remaining neutral and giving no feedback whatever, which is what happens in the first clip. Is the second interviewer modifying the test? Is it assessing something different from the first clip. Needless to say, that is certainly not what is intended. The very fairness of accommodation depends on the accommodation and modification distinction being okay. Can you think of examples in professional experience where allegedly tests have been changed to accommodate pupils, but where you think that in actual fact they have been modified? Hollenbeck, 2002, cites a reading comprehension test where students read the items. So the test measured the construct of silent reading comprehension. If the test were changed so that the items were read aloud for the candidates, then the new construct would be listening comprehension. But are we really able to make this distinction in a convincing way? In our attempts to understand both accommodations and modifications, we are actually disadvantaged by our ready capacity to coin phrases purportedly referring to constructs. Our hazy and maybe indefensible intuitions suggest that linguistic differences between one phrase and another mark differences between the constructs to which they allegedly refer. So we may well think with Hollenbeck that the construct identified by reading comprehension differs from that picked out by listening comprehension. It does seem plausible enough. But how do we arrive at a robust criterion for deciding what counts as one construct rather than another? The ancients believed that the morning star identified a different object from the evening star. Astronomical science eventually remedied their error. Arguably, there is nothing waiting in the wings capable of bringing off a similar feat for constructs. Some might hope that neuroscience could play such a role. Let's play around just a bit with a couple of putative constructs: speed of thought and cognitive ability. Speed of thought and response is often prioritized in ability tests developed in the West. Some other cultures take the opposite view. They think that rapid responses to a problem may well be a sign of stupidity rather than intelligence. See, for example, Sternberg, 2003. So, can we identify a construct, let's call it pace, that can be separated from other constructs related to cognition? According to this story, certain societies value selected cognitive functioning and pace. So they think we are dealing with two constructs here. Others prefer the cognitive functioning without pace. They may even hold that pace is not compatible with the highest level of cognitive functioning. Can we really identify two constructs here? The first would be some kind of cognitive functioning, and the second would be pace of intellectual functioning. The idea would be that these constructs are separate from each other. How might we measure pace? We could offer a time-limited test with lots of test items. In this test, no one is expected to finish, but the better your speed, the higher your score. The thought here is that you could score better than someone with similar cognitive functioning but with a lower pace level. So this time-limited test might indirectly capture something about your pace. It could measure your pace. If we allow more time, then those with similar cognitive functioning and more of a pace construct than the rest won't achieve better scores than the rest. With sufficient time allowed, we end up with scores that are unaffected by pace levels, unaffected by that construct. With plenty of time, we only measure constructs relating to cognitive thinking. We do not measure constructs for speedy thinking or pace. Because the extra time means the test takers don't need to be quick. We can compare and contrast limited time tests with unlimited time tests. If the cognitive challenges in each test are comparable, the differences between the two tests might be thought to be measuring, albeit indirectly, that construct of pace. In this, the provision of extra time means that the original test, which might have been capturing pace, has been modified. In its transformed guise, it no longer captures anything to do with pace. Now we could look at matters in a rather different way, and maybe this is the way we conventionally look at things when we think we are, for example, accommodating dyslexics by giving them extra time in their tests. And here's this different way of looking at things. The candidate with the learning disorder has such and such a level of cognitive capacity. There's that construct. In the conventional test, the disability prevents responses from providing a valid measure of the cognitive ability construct of those with the disorder. With extra time, the disorder is disarmed and the test can probe the relevant cognitive capacity. There's no thought about any kind of pace construct at all. Now, there are many obscurities in these two ways of looking at things, and these two ways of looking at things are not entirely compatible with each other. Which obscurities especially strike you? How could the dispute between the verdict of accommodation and of modification possibly be settled? I suggest to you that there are no easy answers here. I suspect that these problems are conceptual and that they stem from principled difficulties with the very ideas of construct and that supposed distinction between accommodation and modification. So the difficulties associated with ideas about constructs, accommodations and modifications may well be symptoms that all is not well with the key conceptions here. I now want to return to the phonics check itself and to rehearse some quite specific difficulties with it as an assessment device. Let's turn to the real words and some of the problems with them and some examples from the 2018 check. How to pronounce B-L-A-S-T. If the pupil uses the same sound as the middle one in farm and so says blast, that will be fine. Or indeed, if the middle sound is the same as in rant, so the child says blast, that's fine because accents are allowed. But suppose the text used to represent a real word appears to admit of more than one pronunciation, discounting the accent issue now. Only the real pronunciation is permitted. e.g. the infamous COW in the guidelines. Cow is a real word, so must rhyme with how or now. It's no good to rhyme COW with low or toe. A pupil who says co rhyming with low will be marked down in the check because cow is a real word. What exactly is the real word section assessing? What do you think? It's claimed that the check contains 20 real words. Actually, 20 isolated letter sequences are presented. These are chosen so that such sequences could, in principle, be the text versions of real words. Suppose BLOW features. And just for the sake of argument that this letter sequence isn't familiar to the child, she may not know that there is no word associated with the sound made by BLOW to rhyme with cow, so no blow. She may offer blow to rhyme with cow in the check and be marked incorrect. This seems to be moving away from mere decoding. What the check seems to capture here is the limitation in her understanding of words heard in speech, in her speech vocabulary. We should note that it does look as though steps are normally taken to exclude such cases in the real words section. In addition, the check may assess whether the child already recognizes the text representations of some words. This is so unless, that is, a whole range of possible examples are excluded. Let me explain. Suppose, for instance, that BIND was included as a real word. This could be blended to produce something either rhyming with lined, so bind, or with tinned, so bind. Now, if BIND had been offered as a pseudo word, either pronunciation would have been allowed. However, in our little thought experiment here, it is marked as a real word, so only the rhyme with lined, bind, would presumably be marked as correct. But spare a thought for the child who blends it to rhyme with tinned, so binned. She thinks she remembers her mum saying that she has binned some broken toys. The child does not yet know how you write that word binned used by her mother. So she fails to realize that BIND is not how you spell her mother's action. Our pupil cannot work out that the very possibility of BINNED is ruled out because there is no context. Similar points can be made about GRIND. The train of thought goes through grinned. Similarly, please do not use PEAR. For if the child produces something that rhymes with here, so peer, it might be because the child thinks PEAR is the right spelling for peer, as in a lord, or pier at the seaside. MILD should be excluded as a real word because the child might blend the letters to rhyme with killed, as in milled. After all, MILLED is a real word and uses the very sound our child might produce. BEAR ought not to be included as a real word because the child might blend the letters to make a sound that rhymes with here. The sound resulting from the blend does, after all, link to the real word spelt BEER and even to the real word spelt BIER. She needs to know that neither of those real words are spelt BEAR in order to supply the right blended sound in the check. FEAR. If the child blended the letters to rhyme with hair, she is thinking of pear perhaps, she might believe that FEAR was the appropriate spelling for the words that should be spelled FAIR or FARE. there must be many other cases. Unless the check devisers are very careful in what they exclude, not only is the check doing an incompetent job of assessing the extent of the child's spoken vocabulary and confidence, but it also, in effect, identifies whether they already know how certain real words are spelled. For it is the child who does not know grind by sight who might reel the real word grind to create the same sound as that associated with grind. Let's assume that their exclusion policy is effective, and I suspect that it is, for the most part. But this means that the reading process in the real word section is even more artificial and distorted than it may first appear. Now let's consider pseudo words and some of the problems and issues there. The real words have to be pronounced in a particular way, barring legitimate accent variations, but the pseudo words can be pronounced in several ways. So what are the implications for the validity of the check? Is the check measuring more than one thing? How do we know? If it is that a good idea? What are the consequences if the check doesn't actually measure decoding properly? After all, it's what it's marketed as measuring, isn't it? The government defend the pseudo words in the following way, quote, "They are included because they will be new to all pupils. Pupils who can decode non-words should have the skills to read most unfamiliar regular words." By the way, a Grimsby child Googled some of the pseudo words in practice materials available on the TES site and found that some of them were very rude. The guidelines are clear that where more than one legitimate pronunciation of a non-word is possible, any of these will count as correct responses from pupils. In the 2018 check materials, WEAF could rhyme either with leaf, so the child can say weef, or deaf, so the child can say wef. By the way, there was no mention then of other EA examples such as react or great. However, the non-words are apparently selected so that they do not usually admit of more than one pronunciation. All the same, the contrast with the so-called real words in the check is startling, especially given that the check is for 5-year-olds. Barring considerations of accent, real words have only one pronunciation, so half the test has text where, at least in theory, more than one pronunciation is allowed, while the other half has the opposite. Isn't this quite peculiar? Consider a normal non-check situation where pupils are reading properly. When letter-sound correspondences admit of more than one pronunciation, the context informs the reader of which word is at issue. This information guides the final decision about how to pronounce the letter sequence. Is it tear or tear? Wound or wound? More on that later. However, with the pseudo-word task, the child must blend and then stop. So the pseudo-words section of the check arguably constitutes a highly artificial set of decoding tasks, and it has to be very strictly curated. Now for a technical term, homophones. These are different words that when heard in speech sound the same as with prince and prince. Pseudo-homophones are pronounceable non-words that sound like real words, e.g. brain, frog, dirt. Thus, they are normally avoided in reading tests for their potential to elicit unintended meanings. Why should pseudo-words that have homophones that are real words be excluded from the phonics check? Well, suppose tind was included as a pseudo-word. We might say it to rhyme with tinned, as in we're having tinned soup for supper. TIND has a real word homophone, namely how tinned, TINNED, is heard in speech. Suppose the child would recognize and understand tinned on hearing a sentence like, we're having tinned soup for supper, but has no idea how to spell it. She might be forgiven for thinking that she should not decode TIND to sound the same as tinned. This is because the alien symbol tells her that she's dealing with a pseudo word. So she might now fear that she's making a mistake if decoding TIND to produce the sound she hears when someone says tinned soup. This could cause anxiety and affect her responses to other parts of the check. Other examples include SIND. After all, her pupil might recognize and understand signed on hearing her mother say, I signed my name. TAND because of tanned. MAND because of manned. DIND and dined, and so on. The ingenious reader will readily produce other cases. Even if these kinds of examples are excluded from the check or only affect a few children, surely this still matters. We should be concerned about any child this might affect. More importantly, perhaps, the whole surreal scenario points to the distance between what the check purports to measure and reading proper. What is the phonics check for? What is it actually for? That's an empirical question. What should it be for, if anything? A normative or value question. If there is no answer to the second question, then it shouldn't exist at all, unless, that is, there are practicable ways in which it could be improved. Improvement, of course, might mean that in effect we create a new test because we are now dealing with modification rather than accommodation. Some of you will know that the theoretician of assessment Samuel Messick talks a great deal about the normative aspects of assessment. Here are two charts that might go some way towards answering that empirical question. Back to the first question, what, as a matter of fact, is the phonics check for? One view, which is quite popular, the phonics check is one of the tools employed by government in England to force teachers, with very mixed success, to teach reading along synthetic phonics lines. It seems to be yet one more manifestation of Michael Power's audit culture. The expression audit culture, the spread of the principles and techniques of financial accounting into new systems for measuring, ranking, and auditing performance. It exemplifies a lack of trust in teachers to teach in the way that the DFE believes is the way to teach reading, on the grounds that it is a method that it is supported by scientific evidence. The evidence for its mixed success in making teachers adopt one specific approach to the teaching of reading, this evidence comes from the NFER phonics check reviews. What is the check measuring? The charts hint at possible answers to this question. It looks as if it isn't measuring anything like what its supporters intended. At the end of June 2014, an open letter was sent to the DFE urging that the phonics screening check be abolished. I referred to this at the opening of this session. A DFE letter dated 13th of July responded, quote, "We certainly do not encourage schools to spend time in excessive preparation for the screening check," end of quote. Yet they knew perfectly well that some schools at least would do just this. Well, what is excessive preparation? You will have your own views about this. So why have the check in the first place? They responded, quote, "The check provides reassurance that children have grasped the basics of decoding using phonics," end of quote. Now, who did they think needed this reassurance? Year 1 teachers certainly did not and do not. If the check discovers anything useful, teachers can find such things out much more effectively during their everyday interactions. The implication that reassurance is needed at a particular moment in time is worrying. It implies that all children need to show that they have these basics at a particular time. But why? There is a close link between the ages of the children and their check scores. Here's this chart again. Children in 2015 phonics test not meeting standard by birth month. It looks as if the check is measuring, among other things, pupils' birth months. That's not terribly helpful. The government justification for the check was further elaborated. It, quote, "enables schools to benchmark their pupils' performance against national standards," end of quote. Now, the government might, for some reason, want to check up on decoding standards. This could be achieved by sampling pupil performances, as we noted earlier on. There would be no need for a universal check. But why, in heaven's name, would schools want to benchmark their pupils' performance against national standards? If they were keen, would they be assuming that all children's reading progress is linear, that they all ought to progress in the same way and reach specific learning targets at the same time? Wouldn't such assumptions be unwarranted and perhaps destructive? The government said that, quote, "the purpose of the phonics check is simply to confirm whether individual pupils have learned phonic decoding to an appropriate standard," end of quote. But who needs this confirming? Why? It really does look as though they are trying to make all teachers teach all pupils in a particular way, and that this is so regardless of what these teachers know of individual differences and needs. And there is much evidence of teaching to the test directed towards this pseudo-word section, with young children spending hours practicing with nonsense words. We noted an example of teaching to the test for the check earlier on. Now for some other general issues about assessment raised by the phonics check. First, young children's inconsistent performances. Young children are especially prone to inconsistent performances. One day they will be reaching for the stars, while on the next they have regressed sadly to the functioning of a toddler. This kind of point is being made very forcibly, as some of you will know, by opponents of the forthcoming baseline test for 4-year-olds. When assessing very young children, we cannot assume that the trait or construct we are trying to measure is completely stable from one day to the next. Early years teachers are very used to this. They automatically take it into account on a daily basis when arriving at an assessment of pupils' current achievements and difficulties. Inconsistent performances by young pupils is another reason for tests for this age being unreliable, viz. Providing results which are not consistent. The second issue is teacher assessment somehow biased? Is that why the check is necessary? Some defenders of the check are now appealing to empirical research about bias. This research allegedly demonstrates that teacher assessment is likely to be biased in comparison with standard tests devised by external agencies. Check supporters argue on these grounds that the check, after all, may detect some problems with decoding. They say that teachers may miss these problems in their informal, day-to-day assessments. Hence, because reading is so important, the check should be retained to help teachers in their work. Bias or systematic error means that a given assessment consistently overestimates or underestimates the true value of the measurement. So accusations of bias by teachers when informally assessing pupils' decoding skills would mean teacher assessment of decoding systematically overestimates or underestimates the true value provided by the check. The true value being somehow what pupils are really capable of in the way of decoding. The check allegedly supplies this true value, and some will argue that tests are objective, while teacher assessments are subjective, that it is just obvious that the tests capture achievement accurately, that any kind of teacher assessment has to be evaluated in relation to the superior picture derived from tests. I'm afraid that the terms objective and subjective employed in that fashion are too confused to do any really robust argumentative work. They may have superficial intuitive appeal, but this dissipates quickly on closer scrutiny. Why on earth would we think the test gives a superior picture? Teachers arrive at accurate beliefs about what young children know and understand about the reading process all the time. This is whether they are dealing with a whole group or working one-to-one with a pupil. Of course, their judgments aren't infallible. Of course, they get things wrong from time to time. Nothing's perfect, and this kind of assessment isn't perfect either. But Can't teachers make accurate judgments about pupils' decoding abilities? How could we possibly know that a test was more accurate? If they employ a test, whether written or orally delivered, if they keep strictly to the guidelines, both about how the test should be administered and how it should be marked, then any feelings they have about particular pupils or particular types of pupils cannot colour the results. So far, so good. Yet this point does not take us very far forward. Consider teacher assessment of young children. Consider this especially if the assessment is based on interactions with these pupils in a variety of contexts over a period of time. Would this be better at measuring their real reading achievements than any check? What of the claim that a check is scientific, objective, and therefore better than the normal classroom interactions between teachers and pupils?